Recording. And I'm going to broadcast. Okay. Broadcasting to all the attendees. Great. Excellent. Well, hello, my name is Andy Fallett. This event is made possible because of our sponsors, donors, and most importantly, volunteers. We're truly beside ourselves because of your support, as well as the physical distancing. Thank you to everyone that has helped make this happen. I would like to start the day off with an action that has been pivotal in 2020. I would like us to take a breath. Never have I been more aware of my breathing, others breathing, and those that cannot. Arranging this event has been something to look forward to, and a reminder that with each tap of a hammer or exchange of ideas, we can still shape the world around us. And with that, our first speaker, Cappy Counard, joins us from Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. Cappy, thank you so much for making this happen.
It's my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the Seattle Metals Guild inviting me to be here today. I have read about their symposium each year, and I've always wished that I could join them. I have to admit this looks a little different than I imagined, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to connect with all of you during this time of way too much distance and separation. The Seattle Metals Guild has rewritten their symposium, like we have rewritten so many things in our lives this year, in order to bring us together for a shared moment of respite. Thank you for being here for my talk called Shifting Perspectives. I began in 2012 with a piece called Perception. Perception considers the idea that at any given moment, we can only know what we know and not more. The lens through which we look at the world is limited by our accumulated experiences and knowledge, so we can't help but interpret situations and interactions through a restricted perspective. When this piece is closed, the inside layers are revealed through the openings, but they also remain concealed. Once the outer layer is removed, new information is gathered and the nature of the piece becomes clear. I find that we make assumptions about the unseen, almost automatically using our imagination to fill in the missing information. Perception is a metaphor for the experience of learning something new that creates a fundamental shift in how we see things. It can change the entire landscape of an opinion, an interaction, or even a memory. The pearl at the center of perception represents the sometimes surprising and sometimes elusive truth. My work tends to mirror moments of revelation and clarity in my life. At times, new understanding is recorded with intention, but at other times it is revealed through intuitive choices during making that are only recognized in hindsight, through a process of self-reflection that brings the subconscious to the conscious. This is what I'd like to share with you today. When I began graduate school at Southern Illinois University in 1996, I started a series of vessels that first illustrated this point to me. Over the next 15 years, this series told a story of bringing the inside out, opening up, and letting go. The Mississippi Pearl Box, like so many of my pieces, is about relationship. It has layers of intricate metalwork and complicated hidden mechanisms that reference the experience of getting to know people. We all have an outer veneer that we present to the world. The process of discovering what lies beneath can sometimes be challenging and uncomfortable. But when we make the effort, what we discover is often unexpected and rich. When you finally make your way to the tiny innermost boxes of the Mississippi Pearl Box, you find simple natural objects protected inside. These small odd-shaped pearls represent the best of us, the goodness and the potential, uncomplicated and unadorned. The last piece I made for my MFA thesis exhibition in 1999, titled Opening, protects a clay bead made in the 1950s. The clay, like the pearls, is still held safely deep in the piece, but it can be glimpsed from the outside through windows of silver wirework. The push-button catch invites the viewer to open the lid, eliminating that challenge of discovering what is inside. It is intentional that the sculptural containers made during this time do not stand on their own. They exist most comfortably when held in a person's hand. Laying on a table, they appear to be waiting to fulfill their intended purpose. The container Precious from 2002 questions what is most valuable, the gold it is made from, the hours it took to make, or the seed that's held inside. I believe that the seed holds the most power and wonder because of the possibility it represents. Now the seed rests at the surface when the piece is closed, able to be touched, but still protected. Because the hinges are spring-loaded, the seed hovers in the center when this box is opened. With its compound curves and mechanisms, Precious was definitely the most complex construction of any of my containers. During its making, I realized that the extensive planning and engineering was dominating my time in the studio. It was actually the first time that I felt the desire to be thinking less when I was making. To Live Wisely from 2005 is based on a poem by Mary Oliver about a tree growing so old that its branches are ready to break. So she decides to pick up an acorn every day, put it in her pocket, and take it back to plant near her home where the soil is dark and rich. Here, opening becomes a celebration, an offering. Honestly, I often tend to make things more complex than they need to be. Even when I set out to make a simple piece, it somehow becomes more involved than I intended. Looking back at my work, I realized that the technicality in my metalwork was overpowering the quieter ideas I wanted to convey. So I set out to more closely align what I made to the qualities of life that I had come to value most. The white anemone is my favorite plant in the garden. It is so simple and quiet, but breathtaking in its austerity. Caught here in a moment of change, the single petal becomes a shallow, delicate vessel. I wonder if it is possible to capture this as I work at my bench. The quiet, the perfect imperfection, the transition to something else. You see, I had transformed along with these vessels. I had settled down into a calmer stage of life that had a rhythm and a reliable cycle. I reveled in small details and unexpected joys. This tiny box called A Single Thought from 2009 reflects these changes. It is pared down and focused aesthetic more closely reflects the characteristics of the sweet pea seed held in its gold and silver skin. Inspired by a window in an ancient stone structure in Turkey, Shift from 2010 is about how we accommodate for discomfort and adjust to change. The seed is held securely despite the imperfect structure. It's funny how we give importance to certain things that define our work as if it won't be recognized as our work without them. I chose to step out from behind the mechanisms and etched symbols that characterized earlier pieces. It actually felt like a really bold move at the time. Here, I also contemplate letting go of the seed at the core of my pieces for the first time. Absent houses the seed pod instead of the seed. This piece is about the space that is left behind when you let go of certainty. Letting go certainly makes space for possibility. For years, as I continued to make precise gold and silver objects to show the world, I was collecting objects like these, textured fragments of natural materials that seemed to have a past. I also had been kind of joyfully and secretly making pieces in my studio out of these same materials, wood, paintbrush bristles, and rusted steel. This was a moment of transition for me. Not only had my interpretation of the vessel transformed over time, but by creating with materials similar to the objects that were always held inside my pieces, they finally bring the inside out. In the summer of 2013, I took a course called Now Roots with Dutch jeweler Ruud Peters. In preparation for the workshop, we were given an assignment to make a three-dimensional representation of our roots. This is mine, made of wood and paper. It is about how everything in my life begins with people. What I learn from them changes me. Wrapped around these roots are the experiences and influences that build to make me solidly who I am, a seeker and a giver. On the second day of the workshop, we were asked to make a house for our roots. And somehow I knew immediately that I wanted to sew mine a kind of sweater from old blankets that I had brought from home. And I'm not sure why, but the moment I finished the last stitch, I knew that I was going to be asked to let it go. So as I buried my root on a roadside in the Netherlands, I felt like I was being asked to do something extraordinary and, quite frankly, unreasonable. But I had taken the workshop to let go of the past and relinquish the obligation I felt towards my definition of myself as a maker. I understood that by bearing the root, it didn't diminish its value. The relevance had been in the making of it, and I was ready to move forward. I admire makers who are bold and bravely rush into the new and the unknown. I tend to be more hesitant as I move forward into possibility. Incremental change can sometimes feel monumental, and so I focus instead on making work that is as true as possible. I find it necessary to identify the enduring threads that continue to connect my work to the past as my foundation for change. Place. Each of these places I have lived, along with the places I have traveled, have profoundly affected my work. The architecture in particular informs the forms and structure of my pieces. I love the borders on everything and the blending of interior and exterior spaces in traditional architecture when I lived in Japan from 1993 to 1995. When I returned to the US to attend graduate school at SIU Carbondale, I discovered the American architecture that most interested me was barns, silos, and cupolas. In 2004, I traveled to India for several weeks and learned that I love curves and the transitions between distinct forms. In 2007, I studied the architecture in Turkey to inform a new body of sabbatical work. The sweeping curves and junctions inside Istanbul's cathedrals and mosques inspired these pieces. But to my surprise, I was even more affected during that trip by the poignant beauty I found in the carved out cliff dwellings of Cappadocia. There was just something about the uneven openings and the effort that it took to carve into the rock that made me stop and pay attention. So today I am drawn to architecture that acts as a record of wear, time, and change, like these stone walls and doors in Italy and Philadelphia. Objects. As I research and collect them, they teach me about my interests and my aesthetic. In graduate school, I was fascinated by how function dictated form in historic wearable boxes, such as pomanders and scissors cases. Later, Karl Blossfeld's photographs and Ernst Haeckel's drawings satisfied my search for curvilinear structures. These Japanese combs encouraged me to play with asymmetry. So recently, I've been referencing collections of tools to connect my ideas with tradition as a way to create understanding and resonance through shared history. In 2016, I visited the Museum of Tools and Trades in Troyes, France, where the tools are arranged in display cases according to trade. What intrigued me most was that after being used daily for generations, the handles are worn to a smooth sheen and even bear the indentation of a person's hand. At the Ettore Guatelli Museum in Parma, Italy, the tools were displayed in patterns to emphasize the nuanced differences within the same family of object. Some of the tools were broken and then mended over and over, each repair a visual reminder of people's desire to make the tools useful again. At the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, I was allowed to enter the display room so I could closely engage with the objects. Standing among them, I was overwhelmed by the time and effort people have spent in repetitive work to build, make, and eat. Detail. A few years ago, I was taught the phrase, notice what you notice. I have collected more ephemeral moments that draw my attention. And this is what I've learned about my visual language. I love circles, lines, patterns of multiples, and texture. Objects in nature and those that convey a past stay with me. I like to look closely. I noticed this. I am the kind of person who always takes an identical route on my bike ride, but I am still moved enough by what I see to stop and take a picture at the top of the same hill season after season. Within the comfort of the known, I can observe nuances in my surroundings, the light, the height of the corn, the clarity of the air. People and relationships. These are at the core of all of my work. This is my grandmother. She was a maker of strawberry jam, biscuits, and quilts. From her, I learned the value of working with my hands and affecting the world quietly with grace. So my dad was my high school English teacher. He gave me my reverence for education. My mom was a computer programmer. She gave me my analytical mind. And my sisters, they gave me a safe place to find my identity. These are my mentors. Fred Fenster taught me the importance of craftsmanship and how to tell a good story while demonstrating. And if you know him, you know what I'm talking about. Marianne Shear taught me to etch and to be ambidextrous at the soldering table. Richard Maudsley taught me to overbuild mechanisms and to take as much time as I need on a piece without being too precious about it. And Ruth Peters taught me to resist making life more complicated than it is and to value imperfection as a quality. My daughter Sabine and son Cole have changed me and my work the most. They make me embrace the fact that life is a bit messy and unpredictable, but still so beautiful in all of its chaos. These notes perfectly demonstrate our family dynamic. Sabine encourages me. I love you, you're awesome, you're beautiful. Cole keeps me hopping. You're the best and you always look out for me, but sometimes I make mistakes and sometimes it's big. And my husband, Greg, pulls it all together with wit and humor. Kids ate all red E. It took me a bit to figure that one out when I got home that evening. So here is a tour of where I work. These days when I go to my studio to make, instead of seeking far and wide, I look for inspiration closer to home. I observe my everyday surroundings to see what draws my consideration, but I also turn inward. I make work that begins with intention and reflects what I have come to understand about myself and what I value. I have given myself permission to let go of characteristics that defined my early work but no longer feel true. Instead, I assemble the influences that have changed with me into a new vocabulary of making that feels both different and well-known. Beginning in 2015, there were 3 distinct threads of thought that I moved between as I worked at my bench. The first is a collection of bowls. This seemed like an apt culmination of the unlocking, simplifying, and opening up of my series of vessels and containers. I think bowls are the perfect open-ended gesture, like this image. Is it one of receiving or offering? And the beautiful thing is that it is always both, and what it will hold is undefined in its openness. These bowls do not try to contain everything. Instead, they are more like single gestures or phrases. Together, they begin to create a conversation and ask questions of each other. Like much of my work, these pieces are tiny. They are small and quiet because they are about fleeting things, the parts of life that are easy to overlook if you don't pay attention. You know, like the taste of a carrot straight out of the ground or the feeling of cold river water on hot feet. Now there are no layers of intricate metalwork, no mechanisms and locks, no protecting and holding tightly. And honestly, this sometimes feels like a rather vulnerable place to be, but perhaps that vulnerability is essential to allow for change. Along with the bowls, I also explored the idea of balance because, like so many people who have careers and families, the major theme of every day is about trying to obtain that elusive state. I used to picture balance as the equilibrium found when 2 weights aligned, but now 2 seems like such a small number. Here, decisions and the many roles I play at school are counterbalanced by the accumulation of never-ending to-do lists and repetitive chores at home. I realized that some semblance of balance can only be realized when I kind of embrace the chaos and accept the complexity of all those moving parts. Because balance is always a bit tenuous, each of these pieces is adjustable to allow for at least a moment of stability. This final piece in the Balance series turned outward to consider a broader issue in our culture. For the exhibition Imagine Peace Now, Boris Bailey gave each artist a disabled handgun and asked us to make a piece about gun violence. I chose to dismantle mine, forge it, and reconstruct it into a cube. My intention was to untangle this metal object from its complicated social and political connotations. My piece weighs the metal of one handgun against 12,942 wild perennial lupine seeds, because that is the number of people killed with guns in the United States in 2015. I knew it was important for me to count each and every seed in the making of this work, but I didn't realize how difficult and revealing it would be. At first, noticing the nuance of color and size, I thought about each seed representing an individual. As the number grew, the thought of losing so much life and potential was just frankly overwhelming. But the most disturbing moment came after hours of counting, when I could no longer hold the sadness of so many deaths. I became aware that I was doing nothing more than moving seeds into piles, 5, 10, 15, 20, 100, 1,000. I just wish that everyone who has a voice in the gun control debate would be required to count one by one the lives taken each year. It is unacceptable for us to become numb to what those numbers truly represent. In the spring of 2016, I planned to spend my sabbatical working with wood, fabric, stone, and porcelain. But what happened is I totally fell in love with moving metal again. As I worked in my studio, I was listening to news about the growing divide in our country. I was also thinking about the tool collections I had studied in Pennsylvania and Europe, and the idea that work and striving are an apt and significant portrayal of our common history and goals. And so as I hammered metal, I chose to leave evidence of my labor and the way it transformed the material. This led to another body of work called Effort. The brooch compress references sieves and strainers. When making it, I was thinking about how life experiences are kind of separated and sorted and then distilled into memories over time. In this piece, Sift, the holes that transform and diminish as they are forged speak to the inevitability of change. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our next speaker, Steve Yusko. I had been making these pieces for months when I saw Steve give a presentation about his work, and I realized that I was using some of the forging techniques that he had developed while we were in grad school together. Thankfully, he was gracious when I fessed up and gave me the green light to continue. My piece, Other, is about how people's differences are emphasized far more than our similarities these days. This creates a divide that often feels insurmountable and disregards our commonalities. Worn together, these necklaces are initially distinguished by their polarities, but closer observation reveals that they share the same visual language of holding and letting go, effort and acceptance. So those necklaces were made in the early fall of 2016, but I realized after the election that the piece wasn't yet complete. Like so many others in our country, I suddenly understood that acknowledging common human experience is not enough to bridge the chasm that characterizes otherness. It requires more care and effort. And so I began to stitch while thinking about connecting, mending, and honoring what we share. By the time the black and white thread had incrementally become something in between, I had built a scar-like mass, a visual record of healing. This is my hope for us. These earrings, titled Men from 2019, are forged, cut apart, filed, and reassembled. The gold solder flows over the filed burr, leaving a raised line on the surface, reminiscent of stitching. Each encounter and experience we have leaves a lasting mark. Even repaired and rebuilt, the evidence remains. In 2017, I started a curatorial project with the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. It was an endeavor that took my personal research from insular, quiet tinkering in the studio to a place of collaboration and community. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's an amazing place. The Mercer Museum is a 6-story reinforced concrete castle built by Henry Mercer in 1916. It is filled with his collection of more than 50,000 pre-industrial tools. When I was there in 2016, I had an impulse to share it with every maker I know and wondered how it might affect their work. This became the impetus for the exhibition, Forging a Link, Metalsmiths Respond to the Mercer Collection. So when you enter the museum, the architecture soars overhead in the interior courtyard, while winding stairs and meandering passageways lead to these small exhibit rooms lining the balconies. Every surface, including the ceiling, holds tools and objects that archive the daily rituals of domestic work, as well as specialized trades like tortoiseshell comb making, tinsmithing, fruit preservation, and coopering. We invited 22 jewelers, metalsmiths, and blacksmiths who represent a diverse cross-section of our field and who also live within traveling distance of the museum to participate in the exhibition. The project was launched with a weekend gathering at the museum in the fall of 2018, where artists were encouraged to explore the museum and collection for inspiration. The Mercer Museum was so generous to all of us. In asking metalsmiths to consider this historic collection, the goal was not to romanticize the past, but to identify, delineate, and comment on our connection to it, and perhaps even our divergence from it. I just loved being with the artists as they investigated the tiny display rooms, gingerly lifting objects and documenting their finds. Each participant was encouraged to make a work influenced by whatever aspect of the museum and collection they were most intrigued by. The diversity of what drew their attention is fascinating. The tools and artifacts in the collection directly inspired the work of many of the artists. Some were attracted to the castle itself and its unique architectural elements. But for others, concepts like the impact of an entire collection of objects in relationship to each other were most relevant. The finished works were installed throughout Mercer's core collection in September of 2019. Visitors got to discover the exhibition that was displayed across all 6 floors of the museum with the aid of maps and visual guides on the floor, and it was kind of like a treasure hunt. Display cases and colorful plinths were used to distinguish the pieces from the overwhelming mass of tools and artifacts in the collection. Some work was made to be integrated into the displays and live among the collection. Many were presented within display rooms surrounded by the tools that give it context. Here I'm giving you just a little glimpse of Maria's incredible pieces that she made for the show in the hopes that she'll talk about them this afternoon during her talk. From the start, Corey Amsler, the Mercer Museum's Vice President of Collections and Interpretations, was willing to consider every one of the artist's sometimes surprising requests. In fact, he welcomed the unexpected. One day he said to me, "I can't believe how provocative and disruptive the work is. I love it. When you place these pieces of artwork in the middle of one of our displays, people will look at them and then see everything around them with a different perspective." Indeed, this was our intention. Because the artwork disrupted, questioned, and injected a moment of unexpected wonder into the Mercer experience, it inspired people to contemplate a broader way of thinking and seeing through the objects that connect us. Everyone's work, inspiration, and concepts are documented in a beautiful catalog that was designed by Shelley Barron with an essay by Sarah Archer. Every person who contributed to Forging a Link played an essential role in its growth and development. Each solution, decision, and piece of artwork was valuable on its own, but together they bridged different worlds, sparked conversation, changed perspectives, and honored one man's vision of the objects and ideas that are worth preserving. For me, this project was about how an idea can lead to a collaboration that generates a shared goal. And through this shared goal, the world gets a little bigger with a little more common ground between us. The work that I was invited to create for Forging a Link was inspired by the kitchen, because I am most enthralled by its collection of colanders, pots, spoons, and bowls. In my own history, the kitchen was always the domain of mothers and grandmothers, a place of gathering, safety, and warmth. So I referenced these tools of nourishment and offering in this piece called Object of Connection Joined to demonstrate our common shared experience and to honor interconnection. I realize that finding the capacity for interconnection requires both intention and care. And so I engage in meticulous, repetitive acts of making in the studio while I think about mending and uniting. This piece, Object of Connection Unison, was made last year before the events of 2020. The lens through which I see the world has shifted. And I understand that these pieces may be perceived more specifically than I had originally intended. My intention was to suggest that ostensible differences of any kind may obscure the more subtle and nuanced similarities that we share. And that perhaps with awareness, attention, and care, we can build a space of connection where we might realize a different possibility together. This is the part of life that continues to fascinate me the most, how human beings affect each other. In that shared space between us exists the undefined potential to either uplift or diminish, but to change one another nonetheless. That is why I want to end this conversation with teaching. This has been my calling for the past 20 years, an endeavor that continues to challenge me, inspire me, and change me every day. In 2016, my colleague Sue Mendelara invited me to participate in a collaborative exhibition called 2020. Each of the 20 artists was given an identical cast silver element that Sue had carved to alter and respond to. I made this piece called Affect. It is about the great capacity teachers and mentors have to affect their students. This is a responsibility that I think about a lot, because each individual needs something different, a challenge, a word of encouragement, a tangential piece of information that might create an opening for change. That is the value of education. It is almost impossible to remain unaltered in the face of knowledge. Even a teacher cannot continue to be unchanged. Sharing knowledge inevitably leaves spaces that in turn initiate growth. And so my days in the classroom are well spent. Each day is new. So 2020 has confirmed what took me years to understand, that sometimes we must be willing to let go of expectations and the things we think we know for certain. If we do, life will teach us something unfamiliar that has the potential to shift our perception, as long as we are open to it. So let's just keep going, shall we? Day by day, and see what we will learn. It is certain to change us and how we see the world. Thank you.
Cappy, thank you so much.
Sure.
Exceptional. It's a very odd thing to not hear that thunderous applause after that. I can imagine it for sure.
Well, hopefully people have questions. I'm anxious to hear what you think and would love to talk to you about your ideas and what you were thinking about as I spoke.
Perfect. So anybody that does have any questions, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom. We are getting some fun chats in from everybody. There it is, the applause. Perfect.
I'm hearing it. Thank you. I'm hearing it.
So one of the questions that we had prepared was, towards the beginning of your talk, after completing a piece that required a lot of engineering and planning, you expressed for the first time a desire to think less while making. Has that thought stuck with you in your approach to making now?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it was more difficult than you can imagine to give myself permission to do that. I think that because I was so into the technicality of things, and I love that. I mean, I still do. I have, I know people who work in that mode, and I'm completely enthralled with just how they make it and all of that kind of thing. But I think for me, I started to hear the response that people were giving me about the work. And sometimes it was missing what I really wanted them to see about it. I have to say about the work that I make now is sometimes it might seem, I actually had somebody say to me, you know, the work that you made earlier was so much more sophisticated, but in reality, I actually have to sort of draw on everything I know about metalworking and everything I know about making in order to let myself relinquish control and to let there be some things that are unexpected and imperfect. And, you know, and so I revel in that. And so I continue to really enjoy that process, but I still love tinkering in the studio. And sometimes it's just about like, oh, if I move the metal this way, is it going to go where I want it to go? And I can still get just as excited about that.
Fantastic. Do you, I was noticing in your work that there was this nice sort of reinforcement of sort of your active care for an object, the seeds, and then sort of the transition into trying to you carry something or sort of take on some part of element from architecture or, you know, the world around you. And then sort of the progression, then going to tools and sort of the impact of a person on an object. Do you think, where do you think you're going with those sort of back and forths? Do you think that's continuing on or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the process of making, it's about being quiet. It's about, you know, I found that sometimes I love to just make something that's functional and it's really enjoyable. But when I'm making one of my bigger pieces, I really want to have an intention or something that I'm thinking about when I'm making it. And I'm really concerned about what's happening in our world. I'm really concerned about the divide. And so I'm not a super vocal activist in a way. And so through this care, through this sense of repetitive act, through thought, you know, I'm hoping that I will reach people. I have to say that my grandmother taught me a lot about this. She didn't even drive a car until she was 65, and she lived in this little hollow in the small town in Wisconsin. And yet by caring for people around her, she changed, her grandchildren and her kids became teachers. You know, it's just, she affected people from this small space. And I guess that's sort of where I come from a little bit more. And so then but I'm really thinking now about how these objects, and that's the latest body of work, is how these objects can maybe activate and something between people. And so I think that's where I'm moving next with my work. And so it's become a lot more, and I think even through my Mercer experience with the museum, is that idea of collaboration and community, and how can this sort of insular working in the studio then become an outward expression of connection between people. So that's what's been on my mind lately.
Awesome. I think with my question, I kind of stepped on Tanya Crane's question a little bit, which she asked, Cappy, beautiful presentation. I really respond to the push and pull of your work, both figuratively and physically. How do you see your work moving forward? Do you have any things in the works?
So I've been thinking about mending lately. I don't know, I was hoping to get further into this and be able to have an image, but my daughter has this Winnie the Pooh that I got for her when she was born. And she came to me the other day and she's like, Mom, it ripped. And I had to mend, and the mending was right over the heart of Winnie the Pooh. And so I've just been thinking about that idea of mending. And so I think that's my next action in the studio. And I don't know quite where it's going to lead. I just am starting to gather my favorite pieces of clothing with holes in it, and I'm going to start stitching.
Awesome. There's some excellent books on darning that are a thing that I sort of found myself doing during quarantine and everything. So
thank you. I'm going to check that out. I think we have a conversation here, Andy.
Yeah. The next question comes from Jane Drucker. I'm a member of a group, Grandmothers Against Gun Violence. Your piece about guns and deaths that they've caused is so significant. Is there any way we can access just a portion about the piece for viewing?
Yes, please. Please. Right now, it's just here in my home. So if there's an opportunity that I can get it out in the world and have people, I think it's one of the pieces that I may have gotten the most reaction from. There's just, I think it's just, and it's such an important thing to talk about. So I would love for it to be a vehicle of conversation in any way. So please feel free to contact me directly and we can hopefully work something out. That would be great.
Fantastic. Beth Brown asks, when planning a piece, do you plan in detail and do renderings from the start to finish, or do you allow room for choices in the midst of building?
This is something that's transformed over my practice. I mean, I think originally I started where there was space for choices. And then as my work got more complex, and that's what I was talking about with that piece Precious, it was so complex that I would do paper models, I would do copper models, and then before I ever started to work in the precious materials. And so then I was losing that sense of being able to change or make decisions along the way. And so I was a very conscious choice to move away from all of that pre-planning because I missed it. In 2004, I learned to do chasing and repoussé from Leonard Urso. And that sort of brought that spontaneity. I realized, you have to be completely present when you're doing chasing and repoussé. So that connection of the tool to the surface of the metal as a mark. And so that's kind of the beginning of sort of getting back to leaving more space. And I tried to include some of my drawings in the presentation. So you can see that in those very complex pieces, sometimes it got pretty mechanical, but they tend to be looser now.
Kristen Beeler asks, you're drawing so much from objects that live in a particular context, Mercer, Goudelet, kitchen. Other than the Mercer show, what do you imagine as an ideal setting for the works that you make now?
Oh, hi, Kristen. That's a good question. I'm not sure if I know the answer to that. I've been thinking about a show of these objects. I haven't had a solo show for a while, and I would love to get some of these objects in the same place. And I still think a lot about, I tend to move through different tools. Lately, I've been thinking about spoons a lot. And so I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking about, I don't know, I've been thinking and researching a lot about objects in a collaborative space. Can it be in a place that becomes more activated? But I think you've given me something to think about that I'm not quite sure that I have the answer to right now. But I'd love to take that step into getting these objects into people's hands and then documenting what might be happening between them. And that's something I think a lot about.
Yeah, I think that collaboration between the sort of owner or sort of operator of an object could be a really fruitful place for what you're proposing. Exciting. Jennifer Stenhouse asks, what's your current favorite tool? New or worn, simple, clever?
Oh, that's such a tough one. Andy Cooperman always teases me about all my files, which is true. I love my files. I have some really great Riffler files that I always go to. So tools in the studio, my favorite tools in the studio are probably my little stare-at dividers. And I have this one that I use to draw on things that I really love. My 6-inch ruler still tends to be one of my go-to things. Also my miter joiner. But then tools outside of the studio are definitely my collection of spoons and the measuring cup that I got from my grandma when she passed away.
Nice. Dana Cassera asked, is there a book about all the gun pieces? Yes,
there is. I'm sure that you can still get it through Boris. It's a really incredible book, a really, really great publication. Excellent. I could hop up and get it off of my shelf, but maybe that wouldn't be great. But I'm sure we can get you that information, and I'm sure Boris probably still has some left. It's a really great book. Yeah. All of the pieces in this show are so great and thoughtful.
I think looks like we're out of questions in the Q&A. I've got one or two more written down. I noticed that you didn't talk, this is from Kirk Lang. I noticed that you didn't talk much about specific techniques used to construct the complex objects you create. Why do you think that is?
I guess I mean, honestly, so many of those complex pieces I made 20 years ago. So I feel like my thoughts are maybe, I even questioned whether or not I should include them in the talk, to be honest. And yet I feel like it's such a strong part of the story of how my work has changed over time. And so I pared those down a lot, and really there's so many things that I've been doing that was really excited to share. So I think it was just the nature of a 30-minute talk and wanting to focus on the things that I've been doing lately. But I have to admit that I've never been very complex with my techniques. I mean, I've just always loved to solder and figuring things out. It's more just that I love to sit and do the like step by step, and I get really fascinated by like, oh, if I put this here, and then if I do this first and then I do that, then it can, and I love to solve problems. And so if you look at my drawings of the times when I was making those complex pieces, I never used, very interesting machines or anything like that. I mean, it was literally my dividers, my miter joiner, my 6-inch ruler, and I'm just going from there and just kind of putzing around trying to figure out solutions as I go. So lots of paper models for sure.
Awesome. Let me check the Q&A again. I got blocked by screens. As a member of the SMG and a professional welder by trade, it's difficult to transition from heavy metal to fine. What is the most important beginner skill set to enhance? Thank you. That comes from Beth Petrick.
So I think that when you work with metal already, you have kind of a sense of what's possible with it. I know that my husband has taught me to weld so many times, and I've never been able to do it because I'm a solderer. So as soon as that starts flowing, I pull the thing away and it never works. So probably one of the most important things would be to get comfortable with soldering, because the nature of it is so different from welding. But I think so many of the things translate in terms of fabrication and how you're building things. So I think it's great. I think it's going to be a lot easier to transition into working small. I think it's part of it is a state of mind too, though. I think there's this sense of monumentality that comes with larger work that some people just are drawn to. So I think it's, when I look at my students, often it's the scale. They just have a hard time working at such a small scale. Whereas for me, that's my comfort zone. I try to work larger, and some of those sculptural pieces are quite large for me, but I have to get wood involved because it's just not in my nature. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing to see as you move forward. But definitely that, I think one of the hardest differences is the soldering, and once you get that and you can see how the solder flows in the color, you're good to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cappy. That brings us up to the time. We'll take a short break, and then we'll be back for our next meeting here in a second.
All right. Sounds great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with me today, everybody. I really appreciate it so much. Mm-hmm.